Thanks again for being here. Many of you come to this talk every year. We've been doing it for 20 years. I don't know, a long time. Doing it for a very, very long time. So I know that most of you know who we are, the publisher of the GemGuide. I'm president. Stuart is the vice president. And Stuart really is he's our key guy there at Gemworld. He does a lot of research throughout the year. He follows the market trends. He does all this. I like to follow a lot of the industry issues and things that are going on there. Other than responsible sourcing, which you'll hear about a little bit later, we will touch on that because that is a topic that Stuart's been following quite closely. So what we'd like to do here this morning is we're going to get started. You're going to hear a little bit more from Stuart than me in terms of all these market trends and things that are going on. He's going to give you a little overview of what's been happening in the industry in terms of the economic conditions and things that are happening. Then we're going to get into our market trends, and we'll finish off with some industry issues. And so with that, Stuart's going to jump in and tell you a bit about what's going on. Oh, real quick, got to say this. This has been a great show. This has really been a great show. I've been coming here for 38 years, and the buzz has never been like it's been. And every dealer that I've spoken to has said that it's been fantastic. Many said they had their best first day. Some have told me that they've already done as much business as they did the entire show last week. So this is very, very encouraging. So we like to hear that. And now, here's Stuart.
Good morning. We're going to just take a quick run through some industry trends, but we're going to start off looking at kind of where the state of the market is and where it's headed. I think probably most people would recognize that 2019 was a relatively tough year, and that the season turned out to be fairly good for a lot of people, but the overall year was relatively soft, and there's a reason for that. The diamond market in general had a lot of struggles last year. There were issues that just tight margins and really not a lot of confidence in the market, and that tends to weigh across the broad sectors of the jewelry industry. We saw continuation of the trend we've been seeing for years now, unfortunately, and that was more retail doors closing. And even if the parent companies remained, they had basically a consolidation, and we did see more and more actual stores closing. Holiday sales in general, though, as I say, the positive was the November 1 through 24 period that's marked. There was an increase of 3.4% across retail. Most of the credit goes to one sector, though, and that's the non-store retail. A lot of it driven by e-commerce. So this is not a new thing. This is something that's been developing for a number of years, actually. E-commerce savvy millennials, Gen Z, these are the market drivers now. Why? Because the parents' generation, people in my generation, we're not as active in areas of discretionary spending, especially in luxury, than we were in our earlier years. So that's really the main driver. But there are a lot of caveats that go with that. So what's it mean for the year ahead? Well, the colored stone market has both opportunities and challenges. Segments of the colored stone trade market really recognize the need for a transparent supply chain, at least greater transparency, I would say, before the diamond trade even did. And so this is one of the main areas that's now starting to refocus drive in our particular sector of this market. Colored stones as a category also offer more choices to consumers today. We're seeing a lot of things come into the market that fill this space that are not really traditional products to us. That's not a bad thing. More choice, more opportunity to capitalize on it, more opportunity to satisfy certain fashion trends that are starting to form outside of our industry. So there's a lot of opportunities to work with in the colored stone space at the moment. As we mentioned, the season was up for many, so as a result, there is a need for goods. And we've been hearing that so far this week. We got in last weekend, even at Pueblo. There was a much different attitude. Even last Saturday when we were walking through that show, it had been open for, I guess, a day and a half at that point. And there was a lot more excitement among this year than we heard in the early days of the show, actually in recent years. So that's been good to see, and we were seeing it carry over onto the two main shows Tuesday, AGTA and GJX. Again, bigger turnout, a lot more excitement about purchases. So we think that trend is probably going to be a positive thing. There are a number of reasons for it. One of them, as a lot of you, especially if you're colored stone dealers, you already know, the Hong Kong spring shows have been canceled. There are a number of factors happening in the Far East Asian market. The Greater China market, for example, it's continuing into a period of softening in its economic growth. It's still in a positive state, but growth rate is much lower than it's been. China's been a main driver of the gemstone consumption for the last couple of decades, really, with the most strength seen from that period about 2008 forward. It's really started to moderate a few years ago, and now it's at a point where we're seeing a strong return to the West in demand, not only at the wholesale level of the market, but also for internal consumption at retail. I mean, more and more goods are starting to stay over here. So with the issues both related to the outbreak of the virus, but more importantly, the greater issue is really just the economy in general has been slowing, and so the support is not there. You know that there have been even last September's Hong Kong show was influenced by the protests that have continued to go on between the autonomous, this is what we saw before, the autonomous state, at least partially autonomous state of Hong Kong versus mainland China. So these are all considerations that are really helping to support what we believe is going to be just a stronger trend in the U.S., because there are, especially for Tucson, because now the other colored stone shows that tended to be good opportunities are far more limited this year. We are seeing a continuation of the main trends that we saw last year in color. So again, we expect this to be a good show. There is a caveat, though, I want to mention that during the holiday sales, we did see prices, we did see a stronger consumption. As I said, retail was up. Within the jewelry industry, though, it was retail in stores specific to jewelry, according to MasterCard's research, was up 1.8%. The overall retail space was more like 3.4%. But the interesting characteristic that trait we have to keep in mind is that the e-commerce side of jewelry-specific transactions over the holidays was up 8.8%. And that's over the store space. E-commerce as a total in retail was up 18%. That follows the same pattern that we saw in 2018. So we're seeing big growth on the e-commerce side, and we're seeing still a rate of growth at retail store space, but it is smaller. So what's that tell us? Well, we're seeing an effect that there's still way too much material on retail shelves that's on memo, so that does diminish overall demand, incentive to buy when you go to shows, but because we're seeing less and less of that, traditional retail model being the main conduit for selling stones, that effect is starting to be less of a concern. There is uncertainty on the geopolitical front too, and that also tends to constrain consumer spending. So in general, U.S. economic indicators are fairly solid at this point. Now, I mentioned it is an election year. For 22 years that we've looked at this, when you get into that's the 22 years I've been at Gemworld, and we watched these kinds of trends. Without fail, in an election year, the industry, like most, luxury areas, really softens, because you get a situation where people's attention is turned towards what become increasingly combative campaigns in the U.S. That trend is no doubt going to continue. I think we're going to have a good, strong first part of the year, and probably about mid-year things will slow down dramatically. And it's only because there's going to be things that distract retail, consumers away from thinking about retail. Trending at this point.
I'm going to do
Yeah,
sapphire.
go ahead and do
okay.
sapphires.
I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to talk a little bit about sapphires, and then Stuart's going to get into many of the other gemstones I know you want to hear about. But when we do talk about sapphire, and we've talked about this for many years now, blue is the dominant color for sure in terms of sales, and so blue always leads. And now, as far as sapphire production, there's no sapphire production out of Australia, which used to be one of the key sources of sapphire. Where we really are seeing all the sources these days is Madagascar, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. But there's a lot of material on the market, and so the heated prices we're finding are down really on the oversupply with a lot of great sources. And we've mentioned this before with the mechanized mining that's going on. I think Stuart's going to mention it again too coming up. But mechanized mining is really putting so much more material on the market than we've had before. So heat-treated stones, again, prices down a little bit. The unheated, there's really been some good solid demand for untreated gemstones, and that's really pushing up the prices because they're so scarce. The supply is always scarce, obviously, especially Burma. This is kind of an interesting chart that we have up here because this shows that, what's going on with the sapphires in an 11-year period from 2008 to last year. And if you look at the price history in our finer gems, you'll see that, prices, sure, you see that they're up a little bit, or some are about the same. Some are even down just a little bit from where they were 11 years ago. But the point of this is that if for those that always like to say, oh, look at how the gemstones have performed over the years. Well, I don't think that's really great performance over 11-year period for these gems. And actually, a few years back, the prices were much higher, and we've brought them down for all the reasons that I just said, the mining and the oversupply and the heat treatment. We're going to mention some of that a little bit later, too. By contrast, as I said, look what's going on with the Burma no heat in the same period over 11 years. You see some dramatic price increases on these, so big difference. Okay. And Stuart's going to talk about some things we just saw here recently.
So we can take a look at some of the other gemstones that are doing well. Aquamarine is always pretty much a staple. Again, this year, actually, we expect it to do fairly well. But one of the things we've noticed is that for the first time in a long time, we are starting to see some of the really old mine material coming out of safes and into the market. This tray, for example, doesn't show nearly as well on the screen as it looks in the booth, but James Alger, these are all really attractive blues if you get a chance to go and look at them. As a result, though, they are way above our GemGuide aquamarine grid, because this is a type of material that you really just don't see very often. We talked to James about it, and this is rough that he's had in his safe for 40 years. He took it out and decided to start cutting some of it and working with it. And I think we're going to see more and more of that type of thing too. We're in a market now that's starting to really, in a lot of ways, we've had a very strong run for a period of time. In 2019, things flattened out. We've seen even some price dips, because that trend of really starting to flatten out started in about mid-2018. It was pronounced in 2019. We had a dip towards the end of the year in some prices, but when you get these really special types of qualities, they resist all of that. So I think it was just probably the opportune time to bring it out. Very attractive material. It's way above the GemGuide. Morganite, another stone in the beryl family that has done fairly well for a number of years. A little bit softer trending so far, this year, but still doing okay. Same type of thing with tourmaline. We saw some phenomenal tourmaline. The rubellite material had gotten very high in price. Really, that period around 2009, 2010 on strong interest in China, carried on. Prices more than doubled where they were in the GemGuide. A lot of that settled down now. the Chinese market, of course, main driver of red, because red is basically an imperial and important cultural color within the Far East. But again, recently we've started to see some of these really attractive rubellites that you don't typically see. Again, a case where a number of stones, Brazilian material that had been in a safe with a dealer in Germany for close to 60 years, now starting to come out of the market. And again, stones at $1,600 a carat, way above the GemGuide price. Spinel, another area that we've seen a lot of strength the last few years, and especially these more unusual colors that started to come, like the gray. The gunmetal grays and things like this have sold very well. They're not terribly expensive, but they are just, what seems to be really the last few years trending well are the unusual things, those things that are really special within an already known variety, like spinel, garnet, things like this. The unusual colors that have started to show up have done well. They do particularly well with the young millennial designers that are looking for something outside of just the big three or the standard types of gems that you see as birthstones. Burma spinel in another area. This is interesting. Red spinels have had a good run. Everybody's familiar with the Mahangi material that did very well and really redefined the whole price structure. Interesting situation coming with the Burma material. It's pretty, it's a classic source, but now there's some political issues within Burma that are starting to change, at least amongst the younger consuming population, the attitude towards certain Burmese gemstones. And I think that's probably going to work to hold prices probably steady, because we predict that demand is going to, kind of soften for certain Burmese stones. It has to do with the way the minority is being treated within the country. Tanzanite, always a popular stone to a certain extent. It's nowhere near the, its peak years, but there have been a lot of changes in the Tanzanian government in recent years towards their approach to how the material should be produced and how it should be exported. As a result, we're seeing certainly stability in the price structure. It's still lower. The attempts to move the price higher have not really solidified yet in the marketplace, so there is a fair amount of Tanzanite in the market. I think it's reasonable to say that the supply is not going to continue to be as strong as it was in the past. It's not that there isn't material there, but the depths of the deposits now have been worked to points that small-scale mining just can't operate, and the focus on the government is making sure at this point that the small-scale miners can benefit from the resource. So a lot of the larger foreign companies that were operating there are out. And so we think right now the supply is certainly stable for demand, because it peaked in the 90s and early 2000s. Prices are very attractive still for Tanzanite. They've moved up about 20% from where they were just a year and a half ago, but they're still, for this material, you can still get very nice pieces for just a few $100s a carat wholesale. Usually $300 to $400 gets you a nice piece. For years, we were seeing the top end at $600 to $700 a carat wholesale. There are some really, really nice stones that even touch above that point, but the vast majority of the fine material is still available for less than $450 a carat in larger sizes. Opal's been a stone that really has come in and out of. Opal tends to be a confusing stone for a lot of people, including myself, because it's a difficult stone to grade. It's a difficult stone to really understand the quality factors of that, because you just look at it and it either speaks to you, it's either really, really attractive or it's not. Other stones, we can break down colors and clarities and everything else. Opal doesn't work like that. So it's just for the I think one of the main drivers in the market for opal was all of the Ethiopian material really expanded the base and the knowledge of opal, what people expected, but as more and more of that material sold and the stability issues became a concern, Australia has reemerged as really, without question, being the benchmark for quality in opal. And we're seeing more Australian opal once again in the US shows. And the prices, at one point a few years ago, the prices of Australian were coming down and the Ethiopian were coming up. Not anymore. The Australian material has moved back to the point that it really probably warrants. We've been looking around the show. We've seen some very attractive stones, and they are not inexpensive. We looked at a stone the other day that was more than 10,000 a carat, and it was about a 3-carat stone. It was a really attractive piece. We've seen other stones that are even much higher. So the Australian material is returning back to the benchmark pricing that, it's held at the top of the opal market.
Could I add real quick, one quick thing on the opal I wanted to add? Make sure that you ask the questions about it. I was at one of the shows, the other day off site, and I was looking at some opal, and until I asked, there was no disclosure about what it was, and it turns out that it was Ethiopian and it was smoke treated. But by asking the questions, I finally got to the right answers as to what it is. So, very important. We've talked about that before. One of the reasons, obviously, you're at shows like AGTA is because of the disclosure requirements. But when you're out and about, you need to really ask questions, because you're not going to get, a lot of times, you're not going to, have the answers right in front of you on the card in the display case. But sorry, go ahead.
Here we have a couple of photos, courtesy of Phil Zahm. One was, basically a pair of Ethiopian opals and then an Australian stone. But the Ethiopian material is very nice. The Ethiopian material, it's a very attractive material. We certainly, we don't expect that a lot of people working with it would be working with it if they didn't have confidence in the material. When we first started taking notes on this material, $18 to about $37, $38 a carat, and then within a year it had doubled. But it really hit a point for a number of years where the top of the market was about $75 a carat, and then the last few years, no, you see some of this material in the 150, 250 range, but it's never broken above that. The Australian material does much better, and just because of the fact that it's had a longer history of, with a much greater rate of stability, we're seeing prices back in the thousands per carat. Reds are always popular, especially, in whether it's the U.S., whether it's the Far East, whatever, reds are popular. Here is Spinel, a Podparacha, and I believe the other was Ruby. They're attractive stones, again, design pieces from Phil Zahm. Each one, is basically an area of strength in the market now. Pods in particular have been doing well last few years. Later on, Richard's going to talk a little bit about some of the stability issues that have started to come up with color in some of these stones and how it's starting to influence price. Did you want to talk about ruby? You want me to? Okay. In the ruby category in particular, there's not a lot of Burmese material in the market anymore. Prices have gotten to a point, especially in the larger, finer stones, where for the vast majority of retail jewelers and their customers, the stone's simply unaffordable. Where we are seeing more strength in the market is for the East African stones. Prices are lower for the heated stones because the population has just simply gotten too high. For a while, the heated stones were mirroring the same upward trends as the no heat, not the same prices, but every time there'd be an increase in price for a top no heat Burma stone, the heated material would follow up the ladder behind it. Now we're seeing a much greater separation between the two categories. Supply of ruby, ruby used to occupy a space of about 20% of the corundum category. It used to occupy around 20% of what sapphire did. In more recent years, it's hit 50% or more in certain of the categories. It's almost 100%. The point being that the demand is probably not going to support the level of production that's coming into the marketplace and has been out of Mozambique and other places the last few years. Mozambique is the dominant producer today, but some of the material is very, very attractive and rivals the nicest of any ruby you're going to see. Prices have moved up dramatically on this material the last few years, and last year in particular, we actually saw softening in price. And a lot of that has to do, again, we had a strong run both in the color and the diamond industry over a period of, last decade or so, but it's really started to flatten out and prices are dipping down a little bit in places in certain of these categories. And it just simply that they've gotten too high. You get areas where prices are too high, you don't have an inventory, you have a museum collection. If you don't have customers that can afford the product, it has to retool itself. Greenland is something that we've been following this for years, and it's interesting. I think that it has its niche in the market. It's going to be really occupying the commercial quality space. They're focusing on better cut stones, and they're putting forward their transparent supply chain as a chief market driver for the product. They are more affordable because a lot of the material is pretty red, but it's not transparent, or it's transparent, but it's not red. And, as a result, we're seeing that basically the price structure there is going to, hold. It will hold as a favorable condition, but it's going to really occupy only the commercial space at this point. Another thing that they've done, which I think has probably hurt some of their opportunity a little bit, is that they're focusing a lot on cutting their own rough. That removes the layer of the profit that the mid-level of the market usually relies on. So it's going to set up for a mine-to-consumer marketing structure. Excuse me. I just need to take a sip of water. It's really dry in here. Thanks. And as a result, we think that is a viable product, but it's going to mostly be in the smalls. Excuse me. Here's a price chart that, again, looks at some of what's happened in the heated ruby over the period of our current pricing. If we take a look at the 5 carats, you see they're much lower than what we would have in no heat, which we'll take a look at. But you can see that there has been growth. And if you look at the 2008 to 2019 in the larger sizes, you see actually there's been a correction to a certain extent because the market realized the material for what it was just moving too high. And the reverse takes effect when you look at the no heats. Green, another very popular color within the gemstone space. Here, emerald and savorite garnet. Savorite garnet is actually, it's just experienced I guess what I'd categorize a minor correction in price, but it's moved off of its highs. We expect it actually to be one of the stronger sellers in green and in the garnet group in general. There's not a lot of production now. Same type of thing is influencing the market. There have been a lot of regulations in the producing country that limit the access to the material, especially on the Tanzanian side. Peridot is another stone. It tends to be a popular stone because of its birthstone position, but it's also relatively popular because of its price. It's one of the most affordable in the green. Emerald, we've seen a fair amount of changes over the last few years. The Ethiopian material looked like it offered a lot of promise, but as we mentioned last year, the source just wasn't managed well in our opinion. So it became very difficult to figure out where it was positioned in the market. Now the main categories in emerald, again, really seem to be the Zambian and some of the Colombian. The production in Zambia is pretty good. There's some decent greens, but a lot of material tends to be a little bit darker. You don't get a lot of the rich greens. Brazil production is small, but it's focused on an ethically sourced program. Ethiopian, again, there's not as much going on there. Here we can take a look at a chart that we did just to do a comparison. You see there hasn't been a huge change, and that has to do more with there was a period where prices rose, and then they kind of, leveled off. There is an issue, though, with emerald that does not really, that continues to confuse the marketplace. It's the enhancements. Every time there's some understanding of enhancements at the retail level and with the consumers, the producers start coming up with new narratives for new nomenclature, and it really confuses things. There's interest in now trying to come up with a different explanation for how to explain the enhancements and remove words like moderate and stuff, and it's not going to work. It's not going to work. There's only one way to really get around this, and the emerald, if they really want to handle the issue over the confusion of enhancements, the way to do it is for the stones before they've been enhanced to get a preliminary clarity assigned from a lab, be enhanced, go back to the same lab, and have the amount of enhancement then noted. That's not going to happen, but it's the only way that the actual structure would work. So what do? Instead, you get away from the whole, you go back to just disclosing the fact that the stones are enhanced. You sell them based on what the appearance is after the enhancement, and you price them appropriately. The problem with enhancements has never been the stones are enhanced. It's that the stones after they're enhanced are priced based on an appearance that doesn't really reflect the quality of the stone. And that's always been the problem. Garnet is going to be, actually is at this point, the real trade darling. It's a stone that everybody knows by name. For a long time, garnets were a relatively inexpensive substitute for other stones. Now they've gained a lot of notoriety of their own. They're well known. We're seeing a lot of designers using them, especially the more unusual colors like the purples and stuff that have shown up the last few years. And garnet is affordable. The prices have gone way up, but they are still very affordable for every single color that they represent that is represented again by another gemstone like a sapphire or a ruby or something else. So garnets, we think, are actually going to have a very strong run this year. And as I mentioned before, Savorite, the green garnet, is it is in good demand now that the prices have moderated a bit. Demantoid also, not a lot of material, but again, we are seeing actual requests for the stone being reported by some of the dealers that we look at and some of the transactions that we've seen. It's actually interesting. It's young designers that are looking at this material again because it's an unusual stone. Most of the really high-end demantoid, my guess is, doesn't end up in jewelry. It ends up in collections, but it's, It is a stone that we're starting to see, and there are some pieces at the show. Pala and others have it. Zircon, another area where we're seeing more interest again, because zircons is just, you're buying that really bright fire. It's not just the blues anymore. Years ago, we used to see a pretty good demand and a nice palette of earth tones. We're starting to see those come back in, those kind of orangey and straw-colored and orangey browns and reddish browns. So this is a stone we're watching again because they're very affordable. It's a very attractive look for not a lot of money. The blues, you can buy the top of the market for a few $100s a carat, but very nice stones for under $100 a carat. And then the earth tones, you can buy larger, nice stones for under $150 a carat. Again, unusual and special sell. Anybody know what these are? What do you think those are? Of what?
That's fair.
It's rock crystal quartz. The dealer never works with the material, but he noticed that the piece had nothing really inside of it. So he knew he could cut it and get clean pieces out of it. It's Pillar and Stone who, typically they're AGTA members, but they're across at the tent. Pillar and Stone is the place you go to if you want very high-end spinels or really high-end mandarin garnets or rubies or cashmere sapphires. It's rock crystal quartz, because Roland told me he just saw them and he knew that they would be, somebody would buy it after he had it cut, because he said special sells, unusual and special sells, especially to the younger designers.
Yep, jump in, thanks. So every year we always touch on industry issues. I said it seems to be something that I tend to follow, and I know some of the other talks and things that I've done throughout the year focus more on just industry issues. We don't want to repeat what we've talked about. I look back to see what we talked about the last couple of years, and so we're not going to really repeat. We are going to update a couple of things that we have mentioned in the past. So this year I do want to talk a little bit about the sapphire stability update that Stuart mentioned. I would, a little bit about alexandrite, emerald treatments, which he actually just focused on there, and lab opinions and reliance and how it's affecting the market. And then Stuart will touch a little bit on responsible sourcing. So the sapphire stability issue, what's happening now, the labs are starting to check more for stability of color. Originally, this was an issue, and last year I talked about it with the pad parasha, where some of the colors can fade through exposure to light, especially ultraviolet light. And they might revert back, they might not revert back. And the labs are really starting to check for this because there's so much of this material coming on the market. So Richard Hughes, Lotus Lab in Bangkok, we were talking to him already, and he said that he sees more now than he's ever seen this year. He said, like every week now, stones come in, they do the fade test on it, and they're finding that they do change. Mostly the pad parashas, the pinks and the yellows, but also it's with the blues as well. This is the slide I had up last year to show you what can happen with these, with the pads, which with the fade test, with the stability test, what's happening is it's driving out the orange color, and then you're left with a pink sapphire, which is still a pretty stone in this case, but it's not the same price as a pad parasha. So that's what's happening on that. And the labs, all the major labs are testing for this now, so there will be a note on the report as far as stability if there's a problem. The nomenclature issue has been with the alexandrite, and some of the labs now will list any color change crystal barrels as alexandrite. And the problem that I have with this is that I feel like we're really just rewriting history, because even today, if you go on the GIA website and you search under the education areas and you look up alexandrite, you're going to find a definition. And the definition of alexandrite there is going to say that it has to have some component of red and some component of green. And there's a definition that goes along with that. And that's what we've always known. That's what I've learned. That's what we've all learned going through gemology about what the definition is of alexandrite. Today, any color change is considered alexandrite instead of color change crystal beryl, for example. So what's happening is it's becoming difficult. We are getting so many requests from our subscribers for help and assistance pricing alexandrites that are out there, because they go to our alexandrite chart and they look at the pricing and they can't understand, they think the prices should be that, and we explain that they're not. And unfortunately, some of them are being sold for way more money than they should. This is a typical example, and I'm really truly not trying to call it the GIA lab, because there's a lot of labs that are doing this, but if you see this particular one, this is a green yellow changing to a brownish yellow, and this is an alexandrite, and it happens to be 17.5 carats. So, this is part of the problem, because as you know, in the past, wow, you have an alexandrite, you were excited if you had a 2-carat stone. Now you have stones like this, and I put in some of my other talks, I put in multiple reports from even other laboratories with stones that are 50, 75, 100 carats as alexandrite, with some of the ugliest color changes you could possibly imagine. So that's what it is. One of the issues with this that we have too is that this is just a lesson in color, because are these stones color change or are they color shift? And one of the things that as you see where the green is on the wheel and where the red is on the wheel, and that was your typical alexandrite, it's generally considered that if the colors are next to each other, that would be a color shift. So when you have something like what I just showed you, which was a green dash yellow changing to brownish yellow, it's almost not even a hue change at that point. Those are considered two different hues when you say green dash yellow versus yellow, but then there's also modifiers. So green dash yellow is a color, yellow is a color, brownish is a modifier. So we've gone very, very close. There's hardly any change in that stone, 17.5 carats. What is that worth? Not a whole lot. The lab report might be worth more than the stone. But anyway, emerald treatments. So Stuart actually already talked a bit about this. So, and as he said, it's confusing to the consumer about what it is. And most labs are using the minor, moderate, and significant. AGL laboratory is actually talking about modern treatments and traditional treatments with an explanation of each. But there's a lot of confusion about that as well, because the modern treatments are some of the newer polymers, and the traditional treatments would be something like the so-called cedarwood oils. I think it's just real important to just understand that all of these products are manufactured. So there's no such thing as natural cedarwood oil, okay? It's a manufactured product, and it's often mixed with other components as well. What's interesting though, and you take a stone like this, and like what Stuart was talking about, is it'd be really nice to see a before and after, because this stone, if you took all the enhancement out, you probably wouldn't have much of a stone left at this point with an emerald. We've been talking. There've been some industry meetings. We had one here on Monday. They try to talk about information that's maybe new. Some of the information we're able to disseminate. Some of the information theoretically we're not supposed to. But I've spoken with the representative from Columbia. I just talked to him again yesterday about this, and of course he said, "Yeah, you can, anything that I talked about, you can put in your talk." And they're talking a lot about the marketing issues. In his presentation, he said that about 82% of emeralds get a moderate treatment, and we confirm with that, because that's why in the GemGuide, if you're using our emerald prices, we say right in there that the prices are based on a moderate level of treatment. If it has a minor level, or if you're really lucky, none, then you're going to have increases. You're going to have premiums, which could be significant. And if the treatment level is extensive, you're going to have discounts. So most of the stones get a moderate treatment. What was interesting there, when we were talking about this at the meeting, they were saying, well, how come, someone brought up the thing, they said, well, how come when I go around to the show, all I see are minor? You go shopping, you see minor, minor, minor. Well, what is the dealer going to put out in their showcase? They're going to put out their best stones, right? And if they go into the rest of their inventory, they're probably going to have mostly moderate treatment at that level. The advocating for new names, like Stuart mentioned, they don't like the name moderate. They think it's negative, so they're talking about new name changes. They're talking about possibly more levels. I had a discussion with them yesterday, and I said, the more levels, I said, I have to respectfully disagree, because right now you have minor, moderate, and significant, and the labs are guessing at that, and they often don't get it right, and labs disagree. So what happens if we make 4, what happens if we turn 4 into 9, which was one of the proposals at one point? We can't even deal with the 3 levels of treatment, let alone 9 levels of treatment. And it's really important to understand that those levels are subjective opinion of the laboratory using their equipment and everything, but there's not a measuring device to say how much is minor or moderate or significant. And that's another reason you'll also get differing reports on that. And speaking of reports, this is one of the things that's, the lab reports, they're empirical test results and or professional opinions. And most of the time when you're reading a report, you really don't know. Some labs will clearly state that, it's an opinion, but you're really, on your own to really try and figure out just how much of the information is actually scientific or 100% reliable. They should be easier for consumers to understand. A lot of these reports have information. Sometimes you even have to go to the website to see what the information means, and it should definitely be a lot clearer. And it's also important to know that the results can change with new knowledge. So that happens all the time. I think Stuart mentioned one of his talks one time. I remember him saying that the most important thing on the laboratory report is the date. Right? Because if it's an old laboratory report, things may have changed over time. So nomenclature is resulting in a lot of overpricing, and I cannot tell you how many times I have to talk to subscribers about this issue, because they have power E tourmalines and they want to know how much these power E tourmalines are. And more times than not, they're not talking about true Paraiba, they're talking about the Cuprian tourmaline, they're talking about the copper-bearing tourmaline from Mozambique. And there's a big difference in price. So the Alexandrite, which I've mentioned, pigeon's blood, you know, I have to do it. I mean, I know you hear me say this probably too much, but it is probably one of the biggest issues that I have in our industry. There are many labs that use this, not every lab does, but it is a term that has become meaningless in terms of pricing. Do these labs have standards? Yeah, they have standards. Each lab has different standards, though. This lab, this is pigeon's blood. This lab, this is pigeon's blood. This lab, this is pigeon's blood. So you've got all these varying degrees of what a pigeon blood ruby is. We obviously prefer to just have regular nomenclature of what is it. Is it vivid red? Or is it moderate red? Is it strong red? Some meaningful nomenclature. So the pigeon blood thing, and we talked about this in one of our seminars a while back, was a study that Stuart actually did a few years back. And he found, they looked at like 500 stones in 1.5 carat, 2 carat size, and prices were anywhere from like $500 a carat to $50,000 a carat. So, you know, all with laboratory reports, and all reports said pigeon blood. So I think that is something that we really need to start getting away from in the selling side, but I know that, you know, the trade still wants it. Richard Hughes just did a great article for us in our current issue, Sapphire. They actually, yeah, actually our opening slide there was the photo that was on the cover, which was his photo, and of the current issue here for our January issue. And in there he has a little sidebar which is titled "Original Sin," play on words, obviously. And I think it's great because it's a little story about the problems with origin. And we have obviously the origin game. There's some of the auction houses now, they're requiring multiple reports from reputable labs with the same, to get the same opinion, because as we know, you can send it to one lab, get one report, you can send one origin, send another lab, get another origin, and usually what happens is the lab that gave you the lower priced origin, that usually ends up in the garbage, and the report that's better is the one that's being used. And just a fun little quick story. I think it was from 2 years ago. It was here in Tucson, and I was talking to a dealer. I don't know if some of you may have heard this story, but I was talking to a dealer here, and he said that he had a gem in his safe, and he had it in his safe for several years, and he finally decided he was going to sell it, but he couldn't find the lab report, so he knew what the origin was of the original one, and so he resubmitted it to a lab to get an updated new report, and when he came back, it ended up with a quote-unquote better origin. And so I said to him, I said, that's kind of interesting. I said, the stone was in the safe for all those years. I said, what actually changed? And his response was, only the price. Okay. Stuart's going to touch on ethical sourcing here, and then I'll finish up.
Yeah, before we go on this slide, I just wanted to mention one more thing about emeralds, because those of you that are longtime Guide subscribers know that I've written about emeralds a number of times, and also ruby. I think emerald is actually one of my favorite stones because it's a very attractive stone with a very long history. It's one of the few you can trace back to, you know, thousands of years ago and still see it in pieces of jewelry. So it's a revered stone, not just in South America, but also Egypt, places like this. It was a stone of prominence. My point is that to a certain extent, we're probably over focusing on the enhancement issue. The pricing issue is really where we can solve this problem. If you think about a monk's shoe ruby, what's done to that stone to transform it from a stone that, you know, in its rough required clarity enhancement, that's why it was flux heated. We don't agonize as much over those things. It was dealt with from a pricing standpoint. And I think that the same thing is the case, it would be the case for emeralds. Deal with it at the pricing standpoint, because they're beautiful stones. There are a lot of sources for it, but the really important ones are Colombia, and then to a lesser extent probably Zambia. And I think that it's those markets that can resolve this issue. Now to start with a little discussion on ethical sourcing, because we talked about this last year, and I will tell you right now, my thought process on this has evolved a little bit since then. because I've been looking at this for a number of years. 20 years ago, Eric Brunwart gave a talk to a small group in a room downstairs on ethical sourcing during the show. There were 8 of us in the room, 6 of which were from the trade press. And then a couple of dealers came. But the point being that it is an important thing that we take a closer look at transparency of the supply chain. It has been opaque for a long time, but the marketing of ethical or responsibly sourced stones, it continues to grow, but what's growing is the marketing of it. A lot of these things now that we're seeing really don't seem to have a whole lot of strength to the action behind it. It's now become a buzzword. It's the new pigeon's blood. If you want to sell something, you call it ethically sourced. One thing that's actually entertaining, if you go by, I guess Gary won't mind, if you go by the ISA booth, you're going to see that they have a card because now some of their members can get this next level of membership as an ethical member of the ICA. The thing is, I asked Gary, all your members have to do this? And he goes, well, some are doing it, some aren't. I said, oh, well, who do I talk to have the ones that don't do it thrown out? Because if you have ethical members, by default, you have unethical members. And the point being that we probably should look at these things in terms that are more realistic and accomplish what we really want them to do instead of grabbing hold of these buzzwords and throwing them on everything. Because ethical sourcing, it really is an issue of greater transparency in the supply chain because retail jewelers and consumers are smart enough to make their own decisions if they're given the information by which to make that decision. They can make informed judgments if you tell them how material is sourced. And a lot of what's being expressed now is ethically sourced. There's an ethical gem show just up the street. Does that mean everybody downstairs is unethical? You know, this is not the way that's going to work. It's just going to confuse consumers. And if you lose your consumers, we lose our business. So that's my point. I've looked at it for a number of years now, and I've come to the conclusion after actually traveling with Robert to a few locations, Robert Weldon, for the project that they're doing. You know what? Sometimes good just has to be good enough, and I'll tell you why. There's an example of somebody, I don't have his permission to use his name, so I won't, but a dealer who is in this area, and in Malawi, he was insisting that his mining partner there go and apply for a license. This won't fit into my program unless you're licensed. And the mining partner really was resistant to do it, but finally did because he was going to not be supported. He'd lose the capital that was coming in to support the development of mine if he didn't. Would you like to guess who owns the mine today? Exactly. It's the brother of the officer in charge of issuing the mining licenses. So sometimes good has to be good enough. We cannot just take a certain set of values that work here to a certain extent and impose them in other places of the world without knowing what the negative results may be. So good is going to have to be good enough in this space for a while. I also want to say that I think it's up to dealers to know their supply chain and their products. It's up to all of us to know about our products. I will tell you right now, I've seen enough examples of this. This whole process of third-party certification to tell everybody that your product or your company, that's not going to work. You have to be responsible yourself for the products you sell. Getting, whether it's RJC or whoever else, to give you a stamp of approval, it's not transferring over to retail consumers. It's not, in my opinion, a viable approach to doing this. You can't expect people to maintain a sense of romance and nostalgia over gemstones if they're being inundated with all this paperwork talking about how this particular stone hasn't led to to any kind of slavery or death or anything else. It's not that bad things don't exist in the supply chain, but for the most part, at least the places I visited, a lot of the small-scale miners, they're just trying to survive day to day. I was at a conference earlier this year where the issue of silicosis came up, and people got up and said, yeah, we stopped buying beads. Okay, so what you've done now is you substituted starvation for death by silicosis in an area where there really aren't very many other opportunities. This was a small area outside in a rural part of India where people grind stones without any water on a dry wheel, and the people are considered disposable labor, so there won't be any enhancements to the process there to, develop life. But we, as people in the trade at this level, can force those changes. But just boycotting products isn't going to solve the issue either.
Okay, I know we're just coming up on 10 o'clock, which is great because I only have 23 slides to go. So we should be fine. No, I just have a couple final slides here, and then we know it gets to be 10 o'clock, so some of you need to run off to the show. Others may want to stay and have some questions. So real quick, though, we're a research company, and we see that a lot of people are doing research the wrong way. A lot of them are just simply going to the internet looking for things, and when you do that, you really don't know the source, you don't know the pricing. There's so many things you don't know. You're relying on photos, you don't know if it's a good photo, bad photo. Your monitor is different than the next monitor, so you don't even know how it's coming across. But we get an abundance of requests for assistance in pricing. We're always happy to do it for people, but often not enough information is given. I just want to show you this one example because it's so important. Bear this in mind. Ask all of the questions. We get things. I had 2 appraisers just in the last 2 weeks here that sent in some requests for pricing for Burma heated stones with lab reports, and wanted to know what the pricing is, because in the GemGuide we have Burma no heat, and we have no origin heat. Well, what happens if it's Burma with heat? Interesting question, right? But then we said, well, wait a minute. Is there flux residue? What's the quality of the stone, et cetera, et cetera? And what we did find out was when we got the report, we found that down here it is Burma, Myanmar, as you see, and then it says Mangshu. Okay, so it's not Mogok Burma, but that didn't come out in the little thing that came to us. And it says under comments, rubies are commonly heated to modify their color and appearance. Heating residues are deposited along healed fissures during the heating process. So this is what was missing in the information that came to us. So it was not just, hey, what's the premium for Burma with heat? This is Burma Mangshu with glass residue, okay? Total different question. And so these stones are less money, okay, for sure. And this is my final slide. I just had to bring this up here because it's funny. The GemGuide's been around for a long time, 1982, and it's changed in appearance quite dramatically. That's an old logo. And this is an old format. This is spring, summer 2005. And the reason I put this in here is simply because I was walking the show on Saturday and I walked up to the booth and he said, oh, who are you? And I saw him, Richard Drucker, do the GemGuide. He goes, oh, the GemGuide. And he comes down, and he pulls out, he goes, I carry this with me everywhere I go. And he said, where are you guys? I said, oh, we're up in the convention center. And he goes, hey, maybe I should come by and get a new issue. Thank you. Those that need to run is fine. If anybody wants to jump up and ask a question, we'd be happy to take a few quick ones since it's 10:02, 10:03. Anybody? Yes.
It's great that you've told us what's maybe going to happen in the future. My big question is, like, for instance, you talked about the blue sapphire and you talked about the gray spinel. You didn't talk about the sex of the buyers. Are more men attracted to the gray or grayish lavender spinel? And are the blue sapphires, a lot of them being purchased by a woman who is getting an engagement ring? Have you gotten down to that, or is it just the sales?
Color, in general, we're seeing a lot more color in bridal, but the single largest area of growth in the colored stone space in general in the last decade has been self-purchasing women. So it's safe to assume that most of these things are driven by women consuming the products, both as designers at the mid-level of the market and at the retail level of the market. That's the largest category of consumption right now.
Has there been any increase in men purchasing for themselves?
Not that I've noted,
Okay.
but I'll tell you, it's not an area that we've specifically looked at, but I would think we would have seen an offset in the one trend indicating a change that would have had us look in the other.
Okay, thank you.
But to add to that too, the gray though being a good color, I think men in general maybe are more interested in some of the grays. But I think what was interesting though is one of the dealers I spoke to the other day said that he never thought he would ever sell a gray gemstone ever, and now sells a ton of gray. So it is interesting.
I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit about pricing on what's special colors and stuff that we used to pay next to nothing for, like bicolor sapphire or party color or whatever people are calling it, and what you're seeing on that.
Well, it's all gone up, but it hasn't gone up anywhere to the extent that the pure hues have. Everything has gone up, but things have started to moderate. The party colors are probably twice what they were a decade ago, but a lot of the, but they're still very affordable, with the exception of a few, pieces that have a particularly nice presentation of the color and end up then as specialty cuts, where it's actually the cutting that's driving the price more than the base material. But no, we see a lot of buy-in party color stuff. In really, really fine stones, it's still under a couple thousand a carat. And the vast majority of what we see, it's a few $100s a carat.
Anybody else want to jump up? No? Thank you much.